Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're delighted this evening. First of all, let me acknowledge the presence of Sir Edwin Carrington. Ambassador Carrington was, as you know, a former Secretary General of CARICOM. It's fitting that he's here on the night that we're talking about saving CARICOM. And we want to recognize the members of the diplomatic corps that are present, as well as the members of the university administration, faculty, staff, and students. We're delighted this evening to have with us the Honourable Frederick Mitchell, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Bahamas. He's going to be talking about saving CARICOM, and I think when we remember the establishment of CARICOM in 1973, there was a lot of hope that these relatively small, vulnerable states of the Caribbean region could pool their sovereignty together and act as a whole to punch above their weight, to withstand the negative impacts of globalization, and to develop a common foreign policy. The mantra in those early days was, we do it better when we do it together. But CARICOM seems to have lost its way. As Winston Ducaran, the Foreign Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, likes to say these days, CARICOM has reached its limits. It has reached its limits as an integrating body within this region. Now we have to ask ourselves the question, do we need to reform CARICOM? Or do we need to transform this organization? Will this experiment with regional integration go the way of the West Indian Federation? What happened to the Grand Anne's Declaration and Sir Sridhar's A Time for Action? CARICOM seems to be spinning its wheels, and there's a lot of criticism of the organization for that. And it seems as though we need a new vision for this Caribbean integration. And it's my hope that this vision can be accomplished within the context of the existing framework of CARICOM. And I think perhaps our speaker tonight will provide us with this way forward by letting us know how we can save CARICOM. And we have with us the Registrar of the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, Richard Saunders, who is going to do a formal introduction of the Foreign Minister. Richard.
Thank you very much, Chair of the function, Professor Andy McKnight. Sir. I would first like to bring greetings to you all from the campus as campus registrar, and to specially welcome all of you all here this afternoon. I'd like to welcome Sir Edwin Carrington, who has been already introduced as a former head of CARICOM, members of the university administration, faculty members of the Institute of International Relations. I'd like to also recognize Dr. Elaine Monica Davis, who wears two hats. She's also a senior academic, and today sitting at the table as the honorary consul for the Bahamas. We are very happy with the good work being done by Professor Andy Knight in terms of bringing the discussion and the dialogue on CARICOM to the forefront. This is just one of the series of lectures that have been held so far, and I think he has been able to attract very distinguished speakers on all occasions. As we all know, our university's mission is to advance education and to create knowledge through excellence in teaching, research, innovation, public service, intellectual leadership, and outreach in order to support the political, cultural, environmental development of the Caribbean and the region beyond. We are very much grounded in the Caribbean, and it is said that most of the leaders of the region are all graduates of our university. So this we are very proud. But the fact that we have produced most of the leaders, and we still today have to look at saving CARICOM, put some measure of concern on how well we are doing our job. And I think that certainly has to enter the discourse at some time. Maybe we should be doing something better to produce our graduates who eventually lead the region so that they can contribute at the regional level to making some greater clarity in terms of what is happening at CARICOM. Today we are very happy to have a most distinguished speaker who is going to address the topic, Saving CARICOM. Minister Mitchell, Honourable Frederick Mitchell, who is here to speak to us today, currently serves as the Foreign Affairs and Immigration Minister in the Commonwealth of Bahamas. He has been active in public life of that country since 1975, that year when he joined the Progressive Liberal Party. He received his early education at the Eastern Junior School and the St. Augustine College, completing his tertiary education at Antioch College. He's also from Antioch College, Harvard University, and the University of Buckingham, with a bachelor's degree in English literature, master's in public administration, and bachelor's of law. He is also trained in professional certificates of call to both the English and the Bahamas bars. Mr. Mitchell has served in many social and professional organizations. He's a member of the Bahamas Bar. He's a founding member of the Bahamas Committee on South Africa and was an activist in the Bahamas Human Rights Association. So Mitchell currently is the co-chair on the Progressive Liberal Party on Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. He is currently the sole practitioner at the Gwendolyn House and has worked at the Bahamas Tourist News Bureau, the Bahamas Information Services, the Broadcasting Corporation of the Bahamas, the Office of the Prime Minister, the Herald, and several other organizations. As Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Mitchell was instrumental in the fight to integrate Haiti as a member state of CARICOM. He negotiated a number of important international agreements on behalf of the Bahamas, including the Schengen Visa Agreement and the European Partnership Agreement. He was also instrumental in the Bahamian diplomatic mission in Cuba. During his tenure, he established the Bahamas Embassy in China. As a member of Parliament for the Fox Hill, Minister Mitchell established a permanent constituency office in the community, and he has been instrumental in community building with Fox Hill area as well as the wider constituency. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to join me this afternoon in welcoming the Honourable Frederick Mitchell, who will address you now.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a special pleasure to be here, and may I thank Mr. Richard Saunders for his that kind summary of what I did. It was interesting to hear what I did myself. I get to hear it often. I'd like also to thank Mr. Knight our honorary consul for organizing this event, and to recognize Sir Edward Carrington, who is sitting in the audience, who I worked with when I was minister before, and to all of you from the Diplomatic Corps, from the university, my colleagues joining me from the Bahamas, including Senator Bazard, who's sitting here in the front row, and Brigadier Anthony Philip Spencer, who walked in and gave that smart salute. Thank you, sir. The poet, Camus Brathwaite, the Barbadian poet, writes in the work Negus, "It is not enough to be free of the red, white, and blue, of the drag of the dragon." It's not enough to be free of the red, white, and blue, of the drag of the dragon. In the days just before Christmas, the great man Nelson Mandela died. The Bahamian Prime Minister had made arrangements to get to South Africa on a commercial airline. We received a call from the Secretary General's office at CARICOM to say that the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Kamala Persad-Bissessar, had offered a Caribbean Airlines flight to all Caribbean countries without cost, and would we take advantage of the offer? Our Prime Minister agreed right away. He was joined on that flight by the President of Haiti, the Deputy Prime Ministers of Grenada and St. Lucia, the Foreign Minister of Barbados, and the Ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda. That single gesture of Caribbean outreach made an impression on Africa and ourselves, which went far beyond what money could buy. The Prime Minister of Trinidad, who is ethnically Indian, wore on the occasion an African dress and headwear. She was resplendent. She joined the heads of Jamaica, Guyana, and Suriname, who had already made their way there. We appeared in South Africa as a team. That is CARICOM at its best. This was no group of groveling mendicants, as Errol Barrow had once described Caribbean leaders. In South Africa, the leaders got along well, and the chemistry was there. It is that chemistry about which Prime Minister Anthony spoke last year when he hosted the Heads of Government Conference as being the key to CARICOM's survival. Prime Minister Bissessar's decision reinforced the great comfort which the Bahamas got when, in September last year, CARICOM issued a statement in support of the Bahamas in the face of withering criticism by Cuban-American protesters in Miami. We knew we were not alone. Someone had our backs. Tonight's discussion is about CARICOM's survival. I'm pleased to be here. This is a special honor for me and for the Bahamas. Being up at the northern end of the chain, people tend to think of us as a world away and as a world apart. But I've come to tell you this evening that we see ourselves as an integrated part of this region. Our founding father, the late Sir Lyndon Pinling, on the 4th of July 1983, committed our country to this CARICOM project. He reaffirmed that by signing the Grand Anse Declaration in 1989, committing the Bahamas to the single market and economy, although we have some ways to go. All governments of the Bahamas, admittedly with varying degrees of enthusiasm, have embraced the notion that we have a common future together. I come therefore tonight representing that generation of Bahamians to whom the task of governance for today has been entrusted, to renew our commitment to the CARICOM enterprise. CARICOM is not just an economic project, it is the very soul of our people from Bermuda to Suriname. And it is that narrative that I have come to tell. In doing so, I begin by saying thank you to my hosts for their gracious invitation to listen to what I have to say. I recall a man, Pastor David Johnson, who is now sadly passed on. He was being honored with the naming of the village Christmas tree in my Fox Hill constituency. He was then 77 years old, and he said he could not believe it. He could still, on that cool winter evening in Nassau, remember when he was running around in short pants and people were talking, and he and his brothers were talking about the elders of the Fox Hill village. Now, he said, look at me. They are calling me one of the elders. That's the stark reality of time. It reminds us that our time on the stage is short, but I committed myself a very long time ago to the notion that if I ever got a chance to be on a public stage, I would not squander that opportunity. I would do what I was called upon to do. So this then is dedicated to all of those teachers and their patience from the time I was a little boy, my parents, particularly my mother, who forced me to wake up early each morning and to get ahead of the day. Dedicated to Dawson Conliffe and Bonaventure Dean, my old headmasters, all now gone, but they live on in the hearts and mind of their student. And so I thank Monica Davis, Dr. Monica Davis, the Honorary Consul for the Bahamas, to Trinidad and Tobago, who graduated with me from high school in the Bahamas way back in June of 1970 at the Catholic High School in St. Augustine's College in Nassau. James Baldwin reminds us in the Amen Corner how strange life is with its twists and turns, and the twists and turns that it takes. I call these Dickensian moments, after the pattern in those Dickens novels where someone disappears at the start of the book and then magically pops up at the end of the book with a smart and pleasant surprise. And I'd like to thank the Secretary General, Erwin LaRocque, for his kindly providing me with access to the Secretariat's headquarters building, where this work was largely written, and to his supportive staff. Guyana, which V.S. Naipaul, the Trinidadian-born writer, Georgetown, Guyana, that city, which V.S. Naipaul, the Trinidadian-born writer, described in turns as, quote, the most beautiful city in the West Indies, and then the most exquisite city in the British Caribbean, is where I wrote this. And every time I repeated that to someone, even some of the Guyanese, they would say, yes, but that was a long time ago. I also thank the current Prime Minister of the Bahamas, Perry Christie, for permitting my participation in this, even as he complained that I was going to be away from home too long. However, I've always enjoyed a good relationship with all my bosses, and with this boss, the relationship is no different. I thank my constituents and cabinet colleagues, parliamentary colleagues, for their understanding and support. However, I would really be remiss, it would be remiss of me if I did not also dedicate this evening's presentation to a man I greatly admired and respected, and his name was Rex Nettleford. I first met him when I traveled with the late Winston Saunders, a Bahamian scholar and cultural icon in his own right, to Kingston for Carifesta in 1976. To quote one of the English ladies of quality who admired him, this man, Rex Nettleford, simply said, and she said it this way, the most wonderful things. He had a way of expressing life that could not be copied. He was an intellectual leader in Jamaica, widely admired and respected throughout the region as a dancer, choreographer, lecturer, trade unionist, writer, thinker, vice chancellor of the University of the West Indies, and finally as the chair of the Public Service Commission in Jamaica. He died at the age of 76 on the 2nd of February 2010, 4 years ago, and one day before his 77th birthday. CARICOM is an idea born from the genetics of the people themselves. I, for example, am the grandson of a Barbadian, Sonny Ford, who came to the Bahamas with his father at the turn of the last century as a baby. His father was a tailor for the Bahamian police force, and my great-grandmother married to him. Her maiden name was Barrow. Her name was Angelina Barrow. I never knew any of them, of course. The founder of our country, Sir Lyndon Pinling, was the son of a Jamaican policeman who emigrated to the Bahamas. Many in the cabinet that ended the white minority rule government in 1967 had one parent from the Southern Caribbean. And indeed, today, the Governor General of the Bahamas, Sir Arthur Folkes, is the son of a Haitian woman. Our first black member of Parliament in the Bahamas was Haitian, a man by the name Stephen Dillard, and he was elected in 1834. Lyndon Pinling was a classmate in law school in London of the late Dame Lois Brown Evans of Bermuda. She founded the Progressive Labour Party, the PLP, in Bermuda, with the advice and counsel of Sir Lyndon of the PLP, or Progressive Liberal Party, of the Bahamas. And the rallying cry of both PLP parties to this day is all the way. It was Ewart Brown, a successor of Dame Lois and a former Bermuda Premier, who mooted the idea at a CARICOM heads of government meeting of a CARICOM airline that could provide transport for people from Bermuda to Suriname within a single day without having to traverse Miami. I dedicate this to Rex Nettleford because he always talked about the Caribbean ethos. That is what this evening's address is really about, the Caribbean ethos. The CARICOM project came about and continues and will continue because of the Caribbean ethos, what St. Vincent's Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves, amongst others, has called the Caribbean civilization. So, I'm deeply indebted to Rex for imbuing in me a sense of hope and confidence that we, as a people, will one day get to the promised land. Now, shortly after he died, there was a symposium in Kingston which was dedicated to his work and life. Some of Jamaica's intellectuals and scholars were there. I was invited to lunch with some of them. For the first time in the history of my relationship with Jamaicans, I detected despair. This was in the middle of the Dudas affair. They lamented what had happened in their country. They did not see a way forward. They did not think that even with their intellectual capacity that they could see their way clear or a way out. They lamented the rise of criminal behavior in every enterprise, going so far as to say they were shocked that some of the most respected business people in the country were infected by criminal enterprises. This left me quite disturbed. I had come up at a time when Jamaica was bold and strong and relentless and no despair. Even in the worst of the economic issues of the Manley years, that remained true. Michael Manley himself, in speaking to me once, I was a journalist in an interview, described himself after his defeat in 1980 as unreconstructed, unapologetic, and unrepentant. That was the Jamaica I knew. Stay with me here for a minute. We, in the Progressive Liberal Party, returned to power in the Bahamas in 2002. We had lost to the Free National Movement 10 years earlier in 1992, which ushered in a more conservative and laissez-faire attitude toward governance. The leader of our party, Lyndon Pinling, who had founded the modern Bahamian state, was thrown out of office unceremoniously in 1992 after 25 years, and within 8 years was dead of prostate cancer. When we came back in 2002, the CARICOM leadership of Manley, Burnham, Williams, Barrow had all passed on, and we met a new order. The new order was Kenny Anthony, P.J. Patterson, John Bertrand Aristide, Ralph Gonsalves, Patrick Manning, Owen Arthur. All a new generation of CARICOM leaders, all forged in the crucible of the region's premier institution, the University of the West Indies, with the exception of Mr. Aristide. Jamaica's Prime Minister P.J. Patterson explained that Haiti had no other natural allies than we in CARICOM in the sub-region, and he believed that it was necessary that they not stand alone, and he persuaded them to join us. Amongst these new leaders was a commitment to the CARICOM project. Even when there were strong disagreements around the table, you got the feeling that no one would leave. There were some strong disagreements, as in the meeting in St. Lucia in 2005, when P.J. Patterson, in order to forge a consensus on the Caribbean Court of Justice, invited prime ministers to meet with leaders of the opposition. The meeting got off to a rocky start when one of the leaders of the opposition said he would not sit next to a prime minister that was trying to put him in jail. We stayed in office until 2007, when we lost to Hubert Ingram, the leader of the opposition, and once prime minister again. It surprised everyone in the region that we lost, including us. However, we might have seen it coming, because a trend against incumbents had started to develop. St. Lucia had elections in December 2006, and Kenny Anthony lost. Then we lost in Nassau in May 2007. Then there was a loss by Portia Simpson Miller in Jamaica in September 2007. And then by Owen Arthur in Barbados in January 2008. Syed Musa lost on the 7th of February 2008 in Belize, and then a loss by Keith Mitchell in Grenada on the 8th of July 2008. Patrick Manning, then Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, speaking at a political rally in Port of Spain, reminded his party how up to that time he had bucked the trend. Here is how the press reported that statement by the then Prime Minister on Sunday, the 13th of July 2008. I quote, Prime Minister Patrick Manning said yesterday that his controversial actions in the selection of candidates in the last general election were vindicated by the results of the elections across the Caribbean. Addressing the PNM's 42nd annual convention, Manning noted that many people questioned the strategy he employed in the selection of candidates, which saw many senior MPs and cabinet ministers rejected. Let me ask you this question. Where is the last government of Belize? Manning inquired. Gone, the crowd replied. The last government of the Bahamas, he asked. Gone, was the refrain. The last government of Jamaica, he inquired. Gone, shouted the crowd. The last government of Barbados, he asked. The response was the same. The last government of St. Lucia, gone, they shouted. Where is the last government of Grenada, my dear friends? Gone, the crowd chorused. And where is the last government of Trinidad and Tobago? Thunderous applause drowned out the words, here, here. Of course, history now shows that in 2010, a trend had indeed developed, and this trend continued in Trinidad and Tobago. But my larger point here is that we can detect the shifts in our societies by looking at one another. Another example is how in Jamaica, Jamaica started out in the 1970s having a crime problem, and we were in the Bahamas turning up our noses at this. Many of the people fled from Jamaica and came to Nassau, and they would warn us that if we were not careful, we would be facing the same situation with bars and windows and crime out of control. Now, of course, we are seeing these same pathologies in the Bahamas. My point again is, on this anecdotal level, trends seem to develop in our region, and it tends to move from south to north. The trend reversed itself somewhat within 5 years, when, beginning with Kenny Anthony, some of the men who had lost power and women who had lost power 5 years before were back in power again. Kenny Anthony described it on the 4th of July 2012 in St. Lucia as returning to power following a period of political metanoia. This inspired us in the Bahamas. In addition to Perry Christie, Portia Simpson Miller has returned, and so has Keith Mitchell of Grenada. Of the original group that were Perry Christie's peers in 2002, only Ralph Gonzalez and Denzel Douglas are still there, uninterrupted by the vagaries of democracy. Everyone else had lost elections. What we do then in the Bahamas is we look at the CARICOM region and what is happening in the region, because it has been a fairly reliable predictor of what may transpire in our own society. In fact, the talent to run our election campaigns has often come from Trinidad, Jamaica, and Barbados. You may also know that the Progressive Liberal Party, the governing party in the Bahamas, was founded following a visit in 1953 to Jamaica by the founders of the party and talks with the then leadership of the People's National Party. My thesis then is that the development of the CARICOM project is a natural projection of what has been done on an informal basis by people over the years as they migrated from one territory to the next. Who can forget how the lives of the region of Trinidad and Tobago were influenced and transformed by the man now known as the Mighty Sparrow, who hailed from Grenada. I've styled this rather grandly, Saving CARICOM, and that has elicited many responses from many people, but most people have said, how are you going to do that? I argue that it does not need a savior, contrary to the harsh judgment issued by the Trinidadian writer V.S. Naipaul in his essay, The Killings in Trinidad. CARICOM is a project that grows itself. The project is organic. And when one looks at the history of the events, it shows that the Caribbean ethos causes it to survive, compels it to survive. In this effort, I adopt the history as outlined by the distinguished Secretary General of CARICOM, Urban LaRocque. In an address delivered right here in Trinidad on the 3rd of October 2013, the Secretary General gave the summary narrative of the founding of the modern CARICOM project. And I think that one decision that should be made is to adopt a common narrative about the founding of the organization and spread the story. It is important for the history to be reduced to a bite size. It makes for part of the wider understanding amongst the younger people of how we came to be where we are. And the Secretary General wrote, looking back from as early as 1932 through the Second World War, beginning in Dominica with the discussions by the labor leaders, then going through the Second World War with a pause. Then you had the West Indian Federation, West Indies Federation, the independence movements, CARIFTA, and then ultimately the CSME. But each time there was a pause, the whole project resumed and continued. I would only argue also that along with the common narrative on the founding of the CARICOM project, there was the parallel story of the emergence of the Pan-African movement across the Caribbean and the struggle for national independence, the Negritude movement, the civil rights movement in the United States, and the common cause found in the struggle of Indians who had come to this part of the world as indentured workers. All of those blended together to produce what we now call today CARICOM. There were times when the project appeared to be imperiled. It seems to me that most people will say that this was the case during the 7 years when the heads of government did not meet at all. It is interesting reading the 1982 speeches, the first conference meeting after a break of 7 years when the heads did not meet at all. By that time, Eric Williams had passed away, and while some of the founders of the project were there was again a new world order. By the time of the conference took place in 1982 in Ocho Rios, Edward Seaga had become Prime Minister of Jamaica, with Ronald Reagan in the White House in Washington. Mr. Seaga was embraced by the new U.S. administration as a sign that a more conservative era had begun and returned to the Caribbean after the work in democratic socialism under Michael Manley. It is not clear why the conference did not meet during those 7 years. I sought to discover the reasons. The best I could discover was that a row broke out amongst the leaders over some issue, and they simply refused to attend. It was left to ministers and council to carry on the work, and in 1982, the leaders met in Ocho Rios in Jamaica, and conferences have met ever since. The Bahamas joined CARICOM on the 4th of July, 1983. We had become independent on the 10th of July, 1973. I'm not certain why it took us 10 years to join, since we had been participating in the work of many of the institutions of the project from the 1950s. The main one being the University of the West Indies, and then the Council of Legal Education and the Medical Council. Several generations of Bahamians have been trained at the university in the law school and in the medical school. Our first student was Dr. Cecil Bethel, who enrolled in the medical school in 1952. In 1983, I was then working as a special assistant out of the Bahamas Information Services in the Prime Minister's office. I recall two things about CARICOM at that time. The death of Maurice Bishop, the Prime Minister of Grenada, took place on the 20th of October, 1983. The question was whether or not the Bahamas and other CARICOM leaders would support the decision of the United States to invade Grenada to restore constitutional order. According to the recollection by the former Guyana Foreign Minister, and I hope this pronunciation is correct, Rashley Jackson, and it appears on GuyanaCARICOMpolitics.com, he says the following, and I quote, "The Bahamas, Guyana, Belize, and Trinidad and Tobago were against any military action, whereas Barbados and Jamaica were clearly in favor of the OECS countries issuing an invitation to the United States of America to join with them in an invasion of Grenada." I'm happy to have included that story because I have traveling with me two researchers and aides from the ministry in Nassau, Joy Newbold and Jamal Strawn. Ms. Newbold was born the year the coup took place in Grenada in 1979. Mr. Strawn was born in 1988, well after both the coup and the invasion had taken place. The idea that there had been a coup in a CARICOM country had been news to them, and with the inclusion they were enlightened about the story. It led to a full discussion with the Secretary General again on the need for a definitive narrative on how we have come to where we are. That disagreement over Grenada did not break up CARICOM. In fact, at the heads of government meeting in the Bahamas on the 4th of July to the 7th of July 1984, Nicholas Brathwaite, chairman of what was described as the Interim Advisory Council of Grenada, was accepted into the conference as the legitimate representative of the Grenadian people. And the representative of Jamaica, Edward Siaga, was also there at the CARICOM table. The conference continues to meet, often in a most passionate form. And the second thing I remember about that time was Sir Lyndon coming back and saying that a decision was made on the question of putting the tourism school for the University of the West Indies in Nassau. He said that he had made it plain to his colleagues that since the Bahamas was then the leader of tourism in the region, that this was the best place to put the school, and they agreed. That was my introduction to CARICOM. In 1979, as a Director of News and Public Affairs at our Broadcasting Corporation, I got to meet for the first time one Percival James Patterson, otherwise known as PJ. He was then Foreign Minister for Jamaica, in and around the time of the coup against Maurice Bishop in 1979. As fate would have it, I became Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Bahamas in 2002, and then ended up working closely with Mr. Patterson on perhaps the most contentious issue of our era, that of Haiti, and the overthrow of Jean-Bertrand Aristide as President of Haiti, about which I shall have more to say later. I turn now to a document that was adopted by the heads of government in 1997, which loomed very large when I became minister in 2002, but seems now to have lapsed into obscurity. But you will see why I'm arguing now that it should become more central to what CARICOM is and should be revisited and updated. It is called the Charter of Civil Society. It was adopted in 1997, and while it is not justiciable, or so it appears, in that it is not community law insofar as I am aware, the document says the following at Article 26, and I quote, "The states declare their resolve to pay due regard to the provisions of this charter." As lawyers often say, at the very least then, this charter is binding in honor. It forms the basis of a descriptive and normative set of values to which we all adhere and aspire, and if any country does not agree with those values, then ipso facto they cannot be a member of CARICOM. Thus, those who argue in favor of Cuba becoming a CARICOM member without changes in the conduct of the internal arrangements in the governance of Cuba may have an uphill battle. Certainly, for the Bahamas, it was the pretext for us to implement consultations in our country through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with civil society. That practice fell into disuse when the PLP lost office in 2007, and we are now seeking to revive it. Article 25 calls for reports to be sent to the Secretary General periodically. There are supposed to be national committees reviewing the implementation of the Charter. I believe that it is time to put words of this Charter into action. And I believe that while the CARICOM Single Market and Economy CSME is a valuable and valued project and aspiration, you will find that the emphasis on that aspect of our relations and the difficulties of harmonizing economies and market space have caused some of the negativity which we now see toward CARICOM. When you look at the successes of this region and the functional cooperation that has been engendered, the work of the specialized agencies, you will see that CARICOM has been a roaring success. It is time, therefore, to look to human rights issues. Nothing is more contentious than this issue in our politics that I now raise, given the religious aversion and visceral reactions to discussions of LGBT issues in our region. Some people see it as striking at the very heart and fabric of our cultural identity, The Bahamas is not an exception to that aversion, with many people seeing the discussion as a moral and religious one and not a human rights one. My own political career at home suffers because of my insistence that in this regard, like all other aspects of human life, there must be tolerance at a minimum, and we must uphold the principle that the general rights for which we fought as being rights for all people, particularly as a formerly enslaved and indentured people, cannot be derogated from because of someone's sexual orientation. In other words, when the Charter in Article 3 says, states shall, in the discharge of their legislative, executive, administrative, and judicial functions, ensure respect for and protection of the human dignity of every person, that, in my view, literally means every person, and not just confined to what Article 5 says, no person shall be favored or discriminated against by reason of age, color, creed, disability, ethnicity, gender, language, place of birth or origin, political opinion, race, religion, or social class. Now, of course, the Charter is a 1997 document, so orientation was not included, and perhaps even in today's atmosphere, you cannot get a consensus to do so. But the conversation has begun, and the pressure from other societies with whom we deal is upon us to consider what our stand is on the rights of all people. Do we, as a society, for example, condone violence against people simply because of their sexual orientation? The answer to that question must be no, and if the answer is not no, then the Charter is not worth the paper it's written on. The Prime Ministers of Barbados, Frundle Stewart, and Dr. Denzil Douglas of St. Christopher Nevis have begun the public discussions on these issues in their societies. The Prime Minister of Barbados even challenged the Anglican Church on the subject at their provincial synod. That was right and just. The Bahamas has decriminalized behavior associated with sexual orientation. We have available in aid and comfort to any change to amplify the discrimination provision in the Charter, the Constitution of South Africa, which admits to orientation as one of the classes for which there can be no discrimination. There are profound changes throughout the United States and Europe, our main trading and cultural partners on this issue. It would be, therefore, unwise to ignore it. I find that in drafting solutions to contentious problems, one solution is a generic one. One solution is that the Charter can become justiciable, with enforceable rights across the community. Less coercively, it can be open to the Caribbean Court of Justice as the final arbiter of community law to adjudicate upon the Charter and declare the rights of individuals for any aggrieved individual seeking an opinion from the court, declaring his rights, and the wording of the provision of Article 5 can then be reworded to read something like this: no person shall be favored or discriminated against by reason of including, but not limited to, the following: age, color, creed, disability, ethnicity, gender, language, place of birth, origin, political opinion, race, religion, social class, or some other characteristic which, in the opinion of the court, deserves special protection. Of course, the short way to deal with this is simply to add orientation to the list. I have no remit, however, to pronounce on that, and I don't do so. But what is important is that our leaders have already begun the conversation, and that conversation should continue. That conversation, in my view, should be underpinned with the principles of tolerance and the protection of the law for another disadvantaged group. Less contentiously, I suspect, will be the question of the extent to which the principle of non-interference in the affairs of another CARICOM state still applies, given what happened in Grenada in 1979 and again in 1983. When a state disintegrates and is under threat because of natural disasters, that is an easy question to answer, but not so easy when one faces the question of civil disorder over political and civic issues. The experience of Grenada and the restoration of democracy there has perhaps set the precedent that a Governor General or President, acting in his own deliberate judgment, can call for outside assistance, even military or policing assistance. And perhaps the Charter ought to be amended to make clear what the position of member states will be when the human rights of individuals in a member state are so violated that it begs the question of outside interference. This is dangerous ground, I admit, one on which we tread carefully. But I say this against the backdrop of the much publicized speech of the American Secretary of State, John Kerry, to the Organization of American States on the 18th of November, 2013. And this is what Mr. Kerry says. In the early days of our republic, the United States made a choice about its relationship with Latin America. And President James Monroe, who was also a former Secretary of State, declared that the United States would unilaterally and as a matter of fact act as the protector of the region. The doctrine that bears his name asserted our authority to step in and oppose the influence of European powers in Latin America. And throughout our nation's history, successive presidents have reinforced that doctrine and made a similar choice. Today, however, we have made a different choice. The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. That relationship, the relationship, that's worth applauding. That's not a bad thing. The relationship we seek, that we have worked hard to foster, is not about a United States declaration about how and when it will intervene in the affairs of other American states. It is about all of our countries viewing one another as equals, sharing responsibilities, cooperating on security issues, and adhering not to doctrine, but to the decisions that we make as partners to advance the values and interests we share. End of quote. Now, the proof of this declaration by Mr. Kerry will, of course, be in the pudding. The recent developments with CELAC, where the sub-hemisphere is determined to meet without the United States and Canada, is a most interesting development. It parallels the Organization of American States, but is much more Latin-focused. The United States remains in a state of antipathy with Cuba. Cuba, although now welcomed back to the OAS, has said it will not take the seat in the OAS at the OAS table. CELAC, of course, includes Cuba. Mr. Kerry's statements come against the bitter experience of CARICOM in its work with the democratic forces in Haiti during the presidency of Jean-Bertrand Aristide. CARICOM was asked to help, and then Prime Minister P.J. Patterson of Jamaica was in the chair. CARICOM was with the U.S. and other developed countries, assisting in helping with the dispute between Mr. Aristide and his opponents, which was turning increasingly violent. Mr. Aristide had conceded all that the forces arrayed against him, including the developed countries, had asked. We went to the United Nations with troops bearing down upon him to ask for the protection of UN troops to save the elected government of Haiti. The UN equivocated and said no troops were available. Yet, on the 29th of February 2006, Colin Powell called me at my home to say that Mr. Aristide had taken refuge behind a U.S. security mission and had resigned and was on his way to a destination unknown. Following his departure from Haiti, troops were suddenly available to restore order. It left a bitter pill in the mouths of many CARICOM leaders, and the experience is less than 10 years old. In the Bahamas, we say, "You only know me when you need me." The other more interesting public policy issue which to watch in our relations with the United States is our policy both in the CELAC context and in the CARICOM context to marijuana. In the Mexico-CARICOM dialogue in Barbados last year, the then President of Mexico, Felipe Calderon, spoke to a new approach to anti-drug policy, one which takes a market approach rather than a law enforcement approach. It seeks the decriminalization or legalization of the use of marijuana with the appropriate regulation and taxes, as opposed to the resources used to lock up young males and criminalizing them in the process without any hindrance to the use of drugs. The U.S. domestic market is also changing on this. CARICOM has the issue of medical marijuana on its next agenda for heads of government at St. Vincent. It remains to be seen whether the U.S. federal policy will change and what that will mean in the CARICOM region. I say this because the U.S. relationship and interest in this region seems almost entirely based on national security and in particular anti-drug interdiction. The Latins are very much interested in the support of CARICOM countries for their position on the islands known as the Malvinas, also known as the Falklands, against the backdrop of our former status as British colonies in the main, and what they supposed is automatic support for the British position. This new CELAC relationship will be very important going forward. I would suggest also that it will be helpful to this region and hemisphere if Mr. Kerry is able to translate his declaration into a more normal relationship with Cuba, particularly given the moves toward market reforms which are now evidenced in that latter country. It would seem also to make sense that the United States should do so because they have no such diplomatic issues with China. At a recent meeting here in Trinidad in 2013, the American Vice President made it clear that the United States had no objection to our relationships with China, and I believe the U.S. view is very important. China, of course, as you know, is the supplier of capital. They've been a saver, unwilling, with the U.S., Canada, and Europe either unwilling or unable to provide capital to our countries that are highly in debt. China has been a savior. And of course, the Chinese position was given in a policy paper on Latin America and the Caribbean, where they're interested in the natural resources of this region, but also the support of the One China policy at the United Nations. Throughout the conduct of international relations, there is this constant refrain which looks to this region with what is often called a block of votes. One country after another comes calling. They crowd our Council for Community and Foreign Relations with requests for support of one candidacy or the next. The question, as far as the Bahamas is concerned, is whether or not we use the numbers that we have to sufficient advantage. And it's not a rhetorical question, because I think the answer, obviously, is we do not. It makes sense for reform more urgent, lest the parade passes us by. The distinguished Foreign Minister of Trinidad and Tobago has made an urgent case for the expansion of CARICOM to include all the countries and territories in a paper in which he describes a Caribbean Sea convergence. This convergence would encompass some 40 million people and ultimately will include, in the short term, the Dominican Republic, the French territories, including French Guiana, and the Dutch ones, and in the longer term, the American possessions and ultimately Cuba. The idea is unity is strength, or as the Haitians say, union fait la force. These matters are not simple or cheap. P.J. Patterson led the way in bringing Haiti into CARICOM. Suriname is also a member. These nations do not speak English as a first language, and CARICOM has not been able thus far to ensure that documentation and conversations are available in the native languages of those countries. Imagine then including Spanish, a Spanish-speaking country, in CARICOM. Further, there continue to be tensions in relationships between Haiti as a source country for illegal migration. The Bahamas does not confer citizenship on people born in the Bahamas whose parents are not Bahamian. One consequence of this is there are thousands of Haitians in the Bahamas who are undocumented and who have to be regularized in some way or fashion. Immigration enforcement in the Bahamas is becoming stricter. Our country is committed to working on a solution to this. All of this makes the enterprise of fixing our internal arrangements at CARICOM a priority. He goes on to list a number of arrangements. I've mentioned already the inclusion of new members. However, I want to parse some of his ideas and lead us into what I think is the inevitable conclusion. And here's what Mr. Ducaran says. The CARICOM Secretariat is the principal administrative arm of CARICOM, and I recommend a fast-track decision to facilitate the entry. Now, anyone who knows CARICOM and its decision-making will know that the expression fast-track and CARICOM in no way comport. Yet, mandates are piled upon the Secretariat, which is the closest thing we have to an executive arm, but which is resource-starved and undermanned. So, whatever reforms are contemplated for CARICOM, I agree that the need for reform. Amongst the issues are human resources and money. Given the economic issues that we face, all treasuries and ministers of finance will be reluctant to agree to increases in subventions to CARICOM. Indeed, many nations are struggling to pay the existing dues. However, one suggestion is that there ought to be in each country a specific set-aside, a revenue stream which goes straight to CARICOM and its agencies as a means of ensuring funding at the appropriate levels. Further, that the human resources issues can be helped by foreign ministries and foreign trade ministries, indeed the public service generally, seconding officers to CARICOM as part of the public service careers for officers, which service would be part of the permanent and pensionable establishment in their countries, as a means to ensure that the best talent ends up working there. Indeed, the Bahamas has led the way by already offering that possibility to at least 2 public servants per year on secondment to the Secretariat. In terms of the decision-making, clearly, nations will have to bite the bullet to give stronger powers to the Secretariat to ensure that decisions are executed. Those who argue that this is an infringement on sovereignty will do well to remember the saying of Dame Billy Miller of Barbados, that you cannot approbate and reprobate at the same time. With regard to the convergence paper by Mr. Ducran, I'm also proud to say that we in the Bahamas recognize this need for convergence. Within our own country, the Prime Minister has embraced the 3 Ps. In Bimini, the island in the Bahamas closest to the U.S. mainland, there is an investment which will require a significant upgrade to the international airport. The private investor is doing the upgrade to the government specifications, but the cost will be recaptured by credits given for taxes collected on the investment. It is this kind of creative financing that will invigorate economies around the region and is to be recommended for its efficiency and simplicity and speed, with minimum impact on the public purse, but exponential benefits to the public good. This brings me to my pet peeve, the nature and culture of our decision-making around the region. It is manifested in the suggestions which the Bahamas advances each year on the length, for example, of opening ceremonies of CARICOM gatherings. Try as we might, those ceremonies continue to take far too long and interfere, in my respectful view, in the timely dispatch of the work of our body. That is just symptomatic of what I call the deliberative nature of our culture. In other words, we like to talk. Mr. Anthony, in the chamber address, says this: the simple truth is that decision-making, especially in all critical area of trade, when time is of essence, has become cumbersome, layered, and bureaucratic. For instance, it takes months to get a decision from COTAD, and by the time the decision arrives, the reason for the request ceases to be relevant, or the situation which necessitated the request has so deteriorated that the initial solution is no longer the answer to the problem. Those who are familiar with the negotiations in CARICOM, and I see Mr. Knight just handed me something about Sir Ronald Saunders' comment on CARICOM, will understand what Mr. Anthony is talking about. In our meetings and visits, we are fond of invoking the Singapore model for development. How many times have you heard that? We need to be like Singapore. However, we must realize, as Sam Huntington, the Harvard professor, makes clear in his seminal work, Political Order in Changing Societies, that there is a trade-off between rapid development and growth on the one hand and democracy on the other. That trade-off seems to mean this, that if you want rapid growth and development at the same time, then you have to move toward a more authoritarian model of governance. Now that may work in Asia, but I dare say it's inimical to the way we do business in this region. However, something must be done to reduce the amount of words expended and to increase the level of action and dispatch. So, let me try and put this together then in some coherent way. It is clear that the Bahamas and I think that the CARICOM project has much to recommend itself. I've said in another context that if CARICOM did not exist, it would have to be invented. There is no more efficient way to conduct ourselves as small countries, but in some sort of multinational supra-body that will deal with the old traditional world powers. CARICOM, for good or ill, is that body. There has been too much concentration on the issues of market and economy, and not enough on how we actually function and how our people actually succeed and work together. Clearly, in terms of institutional arrangements, the Bahamas has some way to go in convincing its public that this is a good religion to adopt, but I think we are mainly there because we have put our money where our mouth is. As we say in our country, talk is cheap, money buy land. I want to borrow from the convergence model and suggest a couple of items that ought to be carried out with dispatch. In this summary, I mentioned, first of all, the strengthening of the powers and human resources of the Secretariat and a more reliable and dedicated funding mechanisms for CARICOM. Secondly, the closer coordination of foreign policy of CARICOM to leverage the number of votes we have in international bodies for the benefit of this region. I recall the recent visit to the region of a Canadian Minister of State in the Ministry of External Affairs, who came to remind the Bahamas and other CARICOM countries that they should not support a mooted push by Qatar to move the headquarters of the International Civil Aviation Organization from Montreal to Doha because of our traditional friendship. It was a very interesting statement, given the difficulty our nations often have when seeking to get results in Ottawa, even a simple meeting with public officials or resolving the tortuous issues of visas for our students. Leveraging in this context should become a fine art for CARICOM. I also believe that we ought to have a more structured approach in our relations with the United States. One idea is for greater access of our young people into the tertiary level institutions of that country with a right to live and work there in pursuit of training opportunities. Thirdly, I call for a specific focus on the development of young people, including a commitment to double the investment in all of our countries in education over the next 5 years. Fourthly, that our ministers of culture, trade, and finance continue to build on ways to improve the ability of youngsters to use their raw talents to build wealth for this region. I recall a 17-year-old from Britain who was hailed as a genius because he made millions from an app which he invented. And I pointed out that we have that same genius in the Caribbean, but perhaps we don't even recognize it. Did not Usain Bolt, a young man from Jamaica, come from poor and humble circumstances, using his talent, this genius, transform his life into one that is worth millions of fortune? And in the process, he lifted the collective spirit of Jamaica out of that despair that I was telling you about. I worry about him and others who emulate him, that they are not taken advantage of by the commercial hucksters of this life, encouraging the bolts of this world, nurturing them, supporting them, educating them, protecting them. That is a role for that governments can do by their policies, and these should be coordinated by CARICOM. Not only is this true in sports, but in all cultural spheres, including music, drama, and the arts. This is a mission which former Prime Minister Patterson speaks to with some urgency. Fifthly, I believe we ought to declare a state of emergency in relation to the development of boys and men. We cannot continue along the path of the dysfunctions which now obtain across our societies, where so many men and boys are not participating in the society, but instead embrace a life of violence and crime or a lack of stickability. I say this with the greatest of respect and honor to the millions of men and boys who do get it and who do succeed, but we must reach back and help to lift our fallen brothers. Our women, too, should recognize the urgency of this problem, even as they take their rightful place in society. They have an interest in resolving this issue as well. I'm asking that CARICOM embrace this as a priority in fixing our problems. We will not regret it if we are successful. Finally, we must all commit to telling the CARICOM story. This means people-to-people engagement, improved and increased travel and transportation links. The leaders themselves should travel and interact in the jurisdictions one to another. It is a way to build that chemistry about which Kenny Anthony spoke in St. Lucia. When I was opposition spokesman on foreign affairs during the period 2007 to 2012, I continued to travel the region and pay official calls on governments and opposition leaders. There was a look of consternation often on the faces of many when I visited. What are you doing here? There was apoplexy back in the capital by my political opponents at home. However, I wanted to lead by example. CARICOM must be a continuing project and enterprise, in or out of government. the project is both formal and informal. What may be posited about the project is that its success is ensured by turning specialized functions into localized actions the region over. Lastly, again, I mention again the need to revisit the Charter and to reflect the broader embrace of the issues and begin the conversation on public policy and sexual orientation as one of the characteristics for which there can be no discrimination. There are a number of other important public policy issues which require focus. Clearly, these would include climate change and our continued dependence on fossil fuels, transportation and migration, which must be solved. The commonalities of dependence and vulnerability within the context of energy and climate change make these policy developments imperative. However, I believe if we fix the problems of structure and decision-making and human rights issues, our ability to resolve the others will follow. In any event, I've spoken too long, and it is time to stop. In our country, we say, you must talk some and keep some. The process of saving CARICOM is ongoing. Each generation is called to take the project further. I would not urge despair. Mr. Brathwaite of Barbados reminds us in Negus, it is not enough to be free of the whips, principalities, and powers. Where is your kingdom of the word? It is not enough to be free of malaria fevers, of the hurricane, fear of invasions, crops, drought, fires, blisters upon the cane. It is not enough to be able to fly to Miami, structure skyscrapers, excavate the moonscape seashore sands, to build hotels, casinos, sepulchres. It is not enough to be pause, to be whole, to be void, to be silent, to be semicolon, to be semi-colony. To which I add a loud hallelujah and amen. Once again, I'm deeply grateful for this invitation to speak here this evening, and I thank you very much.
Well, I think this is exactly what the Institute of International Relations ought to be doing, bringing this kind of provocative thinking to the public and to our students, the faculty. So I really want to thank the Honourable Minister for coming all the way from Bahamas to visit us and to share his thoughts with us. Now we're going to ask Dr. Elaine Monica Davis to give the vote of thanks. As you know, sorry, before, I guess there's question and answers. Before, I'm jumping the gun. Okay, I'm sure that you have some questions for the Honourable Minister, and there's a microphone over there. I don't know if you want to come here, first of all, but there's a microphone being circulated, and if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll identify you, and you can ask that question.
I get to jump the gun, sorry. Minister, thank you for a wide-ranging speech. I think was excellent. And your courage to deal with some of those human rights issues and LGBT issues as well, and it's quite interesting. You mentioned, there were two things that I thought you might have dwelt upon. You made mention of marijuana, but you didn't dwell on that in the speech. And the other one was the trade in small arms. I was wondering if we could address those two issues.
The question of what I did say about marijuana is what is coming as this public discussion on whether or not we need to use a market approach as opposed to the current law enforcement approach, a market approach and a healthcare approach as opposed to the current drug enforcement approach. What I think is happening is that this discussion or this study, which is being called for by CARICOM now, is leading to that discussion. I think that until the United States federal authorities change their position, effectively can be no change in this region, because that is a solid position which the United States government takes. And given that, I don't think there's going to be much official movement on that for a while, unless there is a shift in the American position. Now, the other issue, the small arms. We have the small arms treaty. We ourselves are about to ratify it. You know, Trinidad was a leader in getting it done. There is so much violence in our own society connected with these guns. We suspect that they're being smuggled in from the United States. We have an issue with the U.S. because they keep saying that because of their constitution, they're unable to assist more than they are able to at the moment, because people have the right to bear arms. And so you can imagine the Bahamas is 48 nautical miles away from West Palm Beach at one end and 50 miles away from Miami. And people come over all the time on yachts, and it's just impossible to police 100,000 square miles of water. So we have, last year, for our population, we had 120 homicides. This has got our population really alarmed. And I know that it's a common experience throughout the region. I've seen the newspaper headlines since I've been here as well, and I'm aware of all the events that have happened over the last years. So I think, again, we have to put our heads together more than treaties to see what it is we can do from a security point of view to fight that issue.
Minister, good evening. My name is Anthony Gafour. I'm a researcher attached to the Institute as well as a judicial officer. Thank you for a very illuminating address. I simply wanted to ask the question as to whether, in the light of the Shanique Myrie decision coming out of the Caribbean Court of Justice, which sought to clarify and elucidate the concept of retrieval from the persons, one of the stated pillars of CARICOM, CSME, whether you thought that in the light of some challenges that some countries have, you mentioned the Haitians in your own country, as well as, of course, with the Dominican Republic situation, whether you might see that as an incentive or disincentive towards closer Caribbean cooperation and integration.
I'm told by my colleague here from Barbados that the response has been at the grassroots level in Barbados a drawing in a kind of nationalism response, that the decision is imposing on Barbados some standards which would open the floodgates. I haven't studied the judgment in particular, but we just received a briefing on this matter at the CARICOM headquarters last week. And just listening to what was outlined by the judgment, it appears to me that it does not go beyond what a normal immigration officer should be doing in any event. And if you look at how they lay out how you're supposed to make a decision on entering the country, and it says that you have prima facie a right to enter the country, but you can be excluded on some specific grounds. But those specific grounds must be real grounds and not arrived at by prejudice. And that should be the ordinary standard in any way. So I'm thinking that, just in my own mind, and I have to read it more particularly in my own mind, that it simply elucidates what should have been the normal standard of conduct of an immigration officer at the border, particularly given the philosophical underpinnings of the CSME. I think it's going to take, some leadership to talk people through this, so there's an understanding of this at the grassroots level. Yes, sir. Oh, the lady? No.
You are the Department of Behavioral Sciences, lecturer.
Yeah.
Good evening. I think it was a rather refreshing perspective you brought to the table, taking more a social integrationist approach,
Right.
as opposed to the traditional economic and to some extent political approach. But do you think it's realistically possible that we can sideline the political and the economic in favor of emphasizing the social? I noticed you touched on a number of what we term soft issues in international relations. Perhaps that whole paradigm of soft issues itself is changing, like climate change and human rights. But is it realistically possible, given that the original purpose of creating CARICOM was for economic integration? That is one question. The second is with regard to the U.S.-Cuban relations. Considering that since 1961 the embargo has been in place through more than 10 American presidents, including President Obama, who lately has made some overtures with regard to family and remittances, family travel and remittances to Cuba. But the Cuban-American lobby still remains very powerful, both in South Florida and in Washington. Do you think that that economic embargo is going to be removed in the near future? Because you seem to be much more optimistic than I am about it. Thank you.
He has, to answer the second question, he has a political problem still, my understanding of it is. But it's clear that, again, on a practical level, the influence of the Cuban-American lobby is waning in the United States, in the sense that those people who were of the generation of Castro are much older now. Their children have no intention of returning to Cuba. They see Cuba as an interesting place to go to on a vacation to see where their parents came from, but they really are not fixed on Cuba in the same way. So I would put it this way: I can't say when, but you know, the environmentalists or the people who look at these issues, like with the fishery, always say, when the fishermen say, no, there's no problem with fish going extinct because we had a huge catch last year. That what tends to happen is, with fish, is that the huge catch is the last catch that you get just before the species crashes. And so what I think is going to happen is that there's going to be a sudden shift. I can't say when, but at a certain point, and the United States shows that this happens in their policy. They just up and decide, well, we didn't like them yesterday, we love them today. And they won't ask us, they'll just proceed to do whatever they wish, and everybody else will fall in line. And I think that's also the answer with the marijuana policy. So just mark, I can't tell you that, but just mark what I said and see if that's not what unfolds. My experience with them and the way they develop policy is that way. I think economics is going to drive it. And if you go to, I don't know if you've been to Havana now, but it's the strangest thing. We just had dinner with the American ambassador when I was there last week. The largest embassy in Havana is the United States Embassy. It's a 9-story building. It's got 50 diplomatic staff and 300 employees. It's supposed to be the interest section of the Swiss embassy. The Swiss embassy has 15 staff. So they conduct, and they under these agreements with the United States, they're supposed to give up to 20,000 visas. So they process visas every day, just as they process visas here. They don't call the head of the head of the interest section, they call him the chief of mission. He's not called an ambassador, but he's an ambassador in everything but the name. There are daily flights of American Eagle planes flying between Miami and Havana every day, taking people back and forth for these countries that don't have normalized relations. So that's what I think, is that at a certain point it's simply just going to come to an end. Yeah.
Second
yes.
question.
About, I wasn't. There's a feature of the design of a presentation of this nature, and because I concentrated on one aspect of it does not mean that I was not saying forget trade. I'm saying, in answer to this question that people ask about saving CARICOM, that people keep looking at the frustrations that they have on trade and not recognizing that the thing actually works. That's the only point I was saying. And that, yes, we have to continue on the trade side because clearly it's a trade agreement. But as we're doing that, we have to recognize that in some real functional areas, the actual thing works. That's the only point I was making. I'm not saying, yeah, right.
Good evening. My name is Amilka Sanatan from the Institute of Gender and Development Studies. I just have a question. Well, the first thing is that I'm usually cautious about your structural recommendations, not yours specifically, but bureaucratic interventions into bureaucratic problems. Because there are many ideological, especially class assumptions that the CARICOM makes and the movement of people in particular. For example, with the legalization of, well, the monetary or the commodification of marijuana as a revenue stream, there's no discussion on the indigenous perspectives to the use of marijuana as it relates to people. So for example, in juxtaposition to President Morales in Bolivia with the coca leaf. Secondly, with the Shanique Mary case, as you would see in the statement given, it is in relation to the Treaty of Chaguaramas. But what if the regional powers or the nations within the member states, were part of it? What would be the civil and the criminal, issues around jurisprudence that would come forward? And also the movement of people. And third, I would just like to give another example. Where labor is concerned, even though corporate entities benefit a lot from the CSME, how do small business enterprise do it? Which are a major form of our economy, well, so women occupy. And if the movement of labor is difficult, so how does a sole trader move freely across the next territory? And do we have community trademarks, as we see with Madrid, that we could register in one island? So if I have Santana, the television show here, I have to find a lawyer in Barbados, find a lawyer in Bahamas, find a lawyer in Grenada to sign me up so I could have my trademarks. And these are some of the labor issues I think are dominant that meet ordinary people's needs and not just graduates of the University of the West Indies. And therefore, Honourable Minister Mitchell, I would like to ask, in the age of Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, and you who are so expert in the political field, since your essay today or your speech was premised on Rex Nettleford, a man who spoke of the inward reach and outward stretch. So I would like for indigenous development, not just what is possible, but what can you promise to the people of Trinidad and Tobago on Thursday, the 6th of February, that you would carry forward in the CARICOM to see achieved. Thank you very much.
Well, I thought I provided a comprehensive list of things. I could start over again.
No, yes, no, but I have your recommendations.
Yes.
I would like to know what are 2 promises I could take home to say that Minister Mitchell, when I had the gracious opportunity to meet him, has promised this, and I can see this being advanced.
Well, I would just say that I hope what you take home is that we are engaged in a continuing conversation, which requires people of your generation to carry the thing forward. I mean, I've tried to say where we came from, what we need to do, how we can execute, in the hope that within this room, because these things are ultimately carried out by people. In this room, someone is inspired to provide the leadership, because it's leadership that's going to carry the project forward. So if what you take away from it is a commitment to this project, that one day you'll be in the place that I am, making the decisions to carry the thing forward. You look at Larocque's history of CARICOM, and you'll see that everywhere along the way, people have tried Caribbean integration. And it's been in fits and starts. It stops, it pauses. But then someone always comes up and says, hey, there are all these islands. We're all in the same place. We have a common history. We have common problems. Why don't we get together? So it just draws itself together. Now, what we're having difficulty with is the administrative arrangements as to how we pull that off. It's not going to be easy. I mean, as you were talking, I was sympathizing with you about the trademarks and the sole trader. I was sitting on an airplane here in Trinidad because the Prime Minister of the Bahamas decided on a private aircraft, we're going back to Nassau, that we were going to drop Baldwin Spencer off in Antigua. So he said, fine, he needed to get to a rally in Antigua. So he would hitch a ride with us on our plane, and we just drop off in Antigua and then go on to Nassau. Well, that required us sitting on the tarmac in Trinidad for 2 hours trying to get the clearances for 2 prime ministers, single market and economy, to travel from Port of Spain up to Antigua. 2 hours. It was outrageous. And we just couldn't fix. I mean, and we just come out of a heads of government meeting of CARICOM. So lots of practical issues like that have to be resolved. Oh, sorry.
Yes, good evening. I have to say I really enjoyed listening to the presentation this afternoon. And even if somebody earlier described it as being wide ranging, I'm sure you would agree that you probably can speak for another 2 hours on all the issues affecting CARICOM. So to some extent, it might not have been all that wide ranging. But the one thing that I noticed, however, was that the extent to which you, well, quoting V.S. Naipaul, you seem to somewhere dismiss the leadership factor as something that would probably help to, that would be responsible or could factor in helping CARICOM on its way forward. And I say that because when we look across the region and we look back at the people who are at the forefront of leadership in the early years after independence, and I don't think that we could disagree that they did a fine job in terms of carrying us forward. But we also look at the leadership at the regional institutional level. And I don't think that we could disagree that in the early phases they did a magnificent job of really carrying us forward. But somewhere along the line we seem to have kind of lost those, and we have to ask ourselves the question, the extent to which the leadership that we do have now or that's coming forward, whether or not they're quite capable of already taking us forward. And we cannot legislate for leadership, but at the same time I think there must be some degree of pressure on those at the top to understand. And just like you said, when you go to a CARICOM meeting, how much time is spent, at an opening ceremony. The fact that you observe that and you have raised that issue at that level, I think one has to also impress upon the CARICOM leadership the extent to which, when you look around and you see who are the people who are coming forward to present themselves for leadership at a national level and even at a regional level, we have to acknowledge that it is not the best that's coming forward. And if we are to really engage in that sort of CARICOM discussion that you're talking about, I'm just wondering to what extent we need to take a little more attention, or maybe get institutions like this university to really start paying attention to that leadership factor and the extent to which we're not seeing the best and the brightest willing to come forward and take this forward.
Yes, now I'm a big supporter of this question of leadership. And I think leadership also comes with training. But in terms of what I said about Naipaul was that he wrote in this essay, The Killings in Trinidad, I think it was about the Michael de Freitas case, that he said something like, the Negro will always need a savior. That's what he said. And what I'm saying is that this view that there's got to be a Messiah that comes and delivers us from the ills in which we find ourselves. I mean, there's one Messiah as far as we know, those in the Christian tradition. But a political Messiah who's going to come and rescue us from the problems, I'm saying ain't going to happen. And I don't think that that's what we need. What we are now in is a more technocratic age. And we simply need to act and plan with dispatch. I go back to the opening ceremonies again, and in my own country, my behavior is considered eccentric or idiosyncratic, because any public ceremony that goes over 60 minutes, I leave. I don't stay for anything more than 60 minutes. I don't see any reason in the world why a public ceremony has to be 60 minutes. And for me, that applies weddings, funerals, church services, no matter. You tell me be there at 10 o'clock, please start at 10 o'clock and be done within 60 minutes, because after that you lose me. And I do it for a reason, because it seems to me that we just have to get on with what we have to do. And that's my point. That's the only point I was making with that. But yes, I'm in favor of the leadership issue.
Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, Anthony Gonzalez from International Relations. Minister, I appreciate your position, and sometimes it's a position that I myself tend to believe in, which is that, as you said, there's some kind of Caribbean ethos based on our human cultural interaction, the way we relate to each other, and so forth. But sometimes I wonder whether this is not threatened by sometimes more profound forces, for instance, the economic ones. If you take the present situation, you see, for example, like in Jamaica, the private sector in Jamaica is pulling apart. It's calling for a retreat. Jamaica should come out of CARICOM. It's not competitive. It needs some time to look at itself internally and so on. You see also, for instance, the move towards a new integration movement with probably half or three-quarters of CARICOM going to Petro-Caribe and ALBA and forming a new integration movement. And as a matter of fact, I've seen where Caribbean ministers and prime ministers meet more in Petro-Caribe and Alba than they meet in CARICOM. Then you have Belize sitting kind of pulling away there also too. I don't understand it too well and so on, and they're questioning the relevance of CARICOM. My point simply is that, is this ethos not threatened by economic forces, which are very powerful given the fact that many Caribbean countries are not doing well? Well, we have serious economic problems, and this is dividing us, and I'm fearful whether, for instance, that we may not be able to rely just on the fact that culturally we relate to each other, and that is something which binds us together.
Yes, no, I think again you're entirely right, but the way I look at it is that all of these things operate in parallel. We have different interests in different bodies, and I think you have to, all of them coexist. I think that's what's going to develop here. The Petro-Caribe developed because so many of the societies depend on Venezuela for energy. I think myself that what's developing is Venezuela itself is developing issues which will affect whether they can sustain what they're doing in the region. And if we watch that play out over the next 12 to 18 months, I think that some of that will dissipate. That's just my feeling. And the other thing I know that Trinidad and Tobago is concerned, particularly about vis-a-vis Jamaica, is the very thing that you're talking about. But again, this seems to me it requires the leadership within the body to discuss what are the mechanisms within the CARICOM project that we can do to ease these issues. It's going to be contentious. There's no way of getting around. Certain things you just have to fight about, but you fight within the context of the CARICOM project. So I think the Caribbean ethos will in fact keep that going.
Good night, Kesrel Ashley from the Institute of International Relations. As a young person, I think I'm pro integration, pro working together. As small states, we need to really work together to pool our resources to make our voice be heard in the international arena. But I think one of our major challenges is our political will. And what I find is a major problem to me is that every 5 years or so often when government change, that there is a shelving sometimes of projects and ideas towards really pushing integration forward. My question is, how do you think that we can really push this integration despite the changes in political parties? Because one thing, you look at the United States of America, their foreign policy pretty much remains the same, whether it's Democrats, no matter who comes in power there, their foreign policy remains the same. But in the Caribbean, we don't have that legacy of pushing CARICOM forward. So even when you're talking about saving CARICOM, I want to know, how is it possible to save CARICOM when political will is really a big challenge for CARICOM?
Put it this way, I'm just thinking out aloud now. You know that Trinidad has, in this region and in CARICOM, perhaps the most powerful, richest, and dynamic economy. Compare what is happening in the EU, and you say that Trinidad is in the same position as Germany is in the EU. So the question will be one for the people of Trinidad, is whether they can exert, using the, let me put it that way, the authority of the wealth that you have, if whether you are, as a people, able to, I don't want to say impose your will, but influence the policies so that they move in a particular direction. I think that's ultimately where we're headed, and that's why when you look at what is happening in Venezuela, or what is possible to happen in Venezuela, I think it will make, relative to other members of CARICOM, Trinidad that much stronger. And then the question is, what does Trinidad do? And to whom much is given, much is expected.
Thank you very much.
I hope that helps. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank
Sorry.
you very much, Honourable Minister, for your presentation. Very enlightening, very refreshing. I have two questions. And to get your views on two areas. The first one is the idea of supranationalism. What is your position on the concept that...
They say you need to put your...
All right,
right, yeah, right, there we go.
Yeah, how could we save CARICOM without at least some degree of supranationality being implemented in the regional integration project? The other question I have is on the question of the relationships that we are currently engaging. When we came together, the original idea of CARICOM was, we would come together as a group to be able to advance social and economic development. And if we came together with full our resources, we would have been able to accomplish that objective. Now, recently, with the multiplicity of relationships that we are engaging in and the various regional organizations and arrangements that we are participating in, I'm getting the feeling that maybe we think that we can get these economic objectives realized by engaging with the emerging economies. I'm speaking especially of the case of China, where we are getting some of these we are getting some of these economic needs met in those relationships. So then, how could we possibly use these relationships rather than allowing them to divide us and to tear us apart and to divert our attention from the regional integration project? Can we possibly use these relationships to advance regional integration?
Well, the supranational point, I think I conceded that early on, that one of the things that this is what I mean by dealing with the decision-making structure of CARICOM. One of the measures that, one of the suggestions already advanced is that the Secretariat itself needs to be stronger than it is. So, for example, would people agree that the CARICOM arrangements should be something that the COTED can just decide? They just go and negotiate it, and they say to the 15, okay, fellas, ladies, that's it. That's the agreement, up or down. You can't amend, you can't change, you can't do anything. That's the agreement we signed, and that's it. And it's implemented. That's a sovereignty issue. And what I was saying, that's why I used Billy Miller's expression. Now, you have to bite the bullet on that. You can't approbate and reprobate at the same time. And that's what we've been doing. It's just going back and forth, back and forth. I think the leaders of the countries and the people who support them have to agree that that's something they want to do. And then, similarly, if you put more strength in the Secretariat, that the Secretary General becomes a kind of commissioner who's able to simply execute. But again, that's what you have to do to strengthen the decision-making, in my view. Now, whether you would support that here at home, I don't know. And the last part of your question, I think that the COSCOR, which is the Council for Foreign and Community Relations, needs to meet more often as the European foreign ministers meet, almost monthly, to deal with what I've called delicately the question of leveraging. Because you said, how can you stop people from picking us up? The only thing you can do, I think, to avoid that is if you meet on a regular basis, so everybody knows what everyone else is thinking. And you're not always going to agree on everything, but you can understand what the other person is thinking. And I think my colleagues were shocked when they asked the question, would any country allow another foreign minister of another country in CARICOM to speak on our behalf? And I said that I was pretty satisfied that, I didn't have the authority to say so, but I was pretty satisfied that there is no doubt in my mind that A.J. Nicholson or Winston Ducaran could speak if they were asked, what is the Bahamas position on such and such, that they could speak authoritatively on the Bahamian position without having to check with me. And I wouldn't even be concerned about it at all, because I know that that's the bond which exists in all of our countries. And I think that's where we have to get to.
Good evening. Minister, a simple question. Are we in the Caribbean community being selectively principled in that we are very strong advocates of democracy and autonomy? And I ask this in the context that the Bhutanese and the Taiwanese and the Tibetan people are fighting for their democracy and autonomy. But we in the Caribbean, we are supporting a one China policy.
Yes.
I don't know if you could provide some enlightenment.
I can't, and I only say this, that foreign policy, national interests are not rationally consistent. I can't argue in favor of one or the next. All I can say with regard to foreign policy is that it is exactly what it is, and nations pursue what they perceive their interests to be. Now, human rights activists have a different role, and that role is to push public policy in one direction or the other. But when you're sitting in the seat of government, you have a more generic or general view of life. For example, as much as I might get annoyed at some policy that the United States pursues with regard to the Bahamas, I always have to think that the average Bahamian wants his government to do nothing to jeopardize his ability to get a visa to go to Miami. And now that may seem very funny or very strange, but that's important to the voter in the Bahamas. So I can have all kinds of high-flying ideas about policy and all the rest of it. Just don't do anything to jeopardize that, because they're with you up to the point at which that can't happen. And when that can't happen, I've got trouble at home politically. So that's just the practicalities of the politics.
Honourable Minister, very briefly, just to tell you that I felt very warm listening to your presentation. I felt warm also because I feel basically, although maybe it was a little hidden, that your presentation basically was anchored in norms and principles of human rights, including the charter, the CARICOM Charter, civil society. I'm very happy you brought this up. I myself, I am of Swiss origin, nobody is perfect, but I'm an adoptive son of Trinidad and Tobago, having spent 30 years in the United Nations, doing training, diplomacy training, and human rights training all over the place. And friends here in this room, including Edwin Carrington, could tell you how I was harassing them many times about getting that civil society charter back to life. I'm very happy to hear that you are initiating it now in the Bahamas again, that you even have set up, I think, a committee as it is foreseen in the charter. Unfortunately, I don't think the other CARICOM states are as far as that. For them, although it was celebrated with big fanfare in Antigua 1997, I was there. Nothing much has happened. Most of the governments have the charter collecting dust in their various ministries. But I'm very pleased to hear that at least the Bahamas, you have taken the initiative to get this rolling again. It is highly important and certainly very relevant for the Caribbean.
Yes, well, I'm trying to get the discussion going. Mr. Incinali last night, we were talking about this charter because he was, you were a public official in Guyana at the time the charter was adopted. And as I said, it's fallen into disuse. I don't know if you ask people about whether people actually know it exists. But when we came to office in 2002, we wanted to make a decision to join the Caribbean single market and economy. And in order to facilitate that, CARICOM advised us that there was the civil society charter. And one of the strictures in the charter was that there needed to be a public discussion body, let's put it that way, or consultation with civil society. So we implemented that, and in the foreign ministry there used to be every month a public discussion on some subject or other. in anticipation of joining the single market and economy. Well, we all know that fell away. It was a dreadful campaign. We failed miserably in seeking to persuade our people to do so. And ultimately, the other members of CARICOM agreed to allow us to opt out of the provisions except for the functional cooperation provisions, but to be able to join on to the single market when the Bahamas was at a stage that it could do so. So that's how it turned out. And it's time now to, not necessarily on the particular subject, but it's time to put that back in place, that you have some formal consultation mechanisms with the population at large, that people are able to come and discuss ideas about the development of civil society. That's one question.
Hi, good evening. Thank you again for your presentation. It was really very enlightening and opened my eyes to a lot of issues. My question is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't hear you mention human trafficking at all. In the 2013 U.S. TIP report listed 6 CARICOM countries on the Tier 2 watch list. That's the list of countries whose numbers are increasingly going up with regards to human trafficking, and an additional 4 countries on the Tier 2 list, with countries that don't comply with minimum standards. What is CARICOM fixing to do to address the human trafficking issue growing in the Caribbean region?
Well, there is a disagreement between all CARICOM countries and the United States with regard to how they approach this matter. This approach they have of, I don't know, I guess you call it naming and shaming, is seen by many countries as an intrusion into their internal affairs. The practicalities of it are, however, we in the Bahamas have been working, and I don't know what the case is in Trinidad, but I'm certain it must be a similar case, and in Jamaica, have been working with the local embassy to try and deal with this as an issue. And the thing we have said to them is that there is indeed a recognition of trafficking issues, but resources, that's the problem. And all these unfunded mandates that are being imposed on countries at a time when they're simply unable to respond to them. So it's not a lack of political will or acknowledgement or any of these things. So, and in my not mentioning it, I'm not saying that it's not an important aspect of, because we're very concerned about it. We were on this Tier 2 watch list last year, which meant that some development assistance, which was largely military assistance, would be stopped, and a number of other things. And again, for us, it's not the actual amounts, because the amounts are not significant. What it is the political fallout of the United States sanctioning the Bahamas. And we've told them that that approach is unhelpful. I know when I was minister before, because they do this, they have an annual drugs report, they have an annual human rights report, and I remember ministers would meet and be really exercised by some of the things that appeared in these reports. And I simply said one day, why would CARICOM then not invest some resources in doing similar reports about the United States? You know, they issue warnings about crime in the Bahamas. But every Christmas, we in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Bahamas have to issue warnings to Bahamians going to Miami to be careful that they're not robbed in Miami of their passports, and people bumping them on the highway, breaking into their cars in the shopping centers. We do that as a routine. So I'm saying that in part the responses have to be the self-assurance of our own countries about our ability to stand up to things that are simply untrue or unfair. But we have, because of our economic situation, I suspect, have become so timid with regard to this that people are able to say and do and hand us any plate, and we just back up in the face of it. But I don't think it's because we don't have the political will or we don't feel that these are important issues. it? All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. I'm going to ask now the biggest cheerleader of the Bahamas to come and give a vote of thanks to the Minister, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Chair. Can't do much cheerleading with my sprained ankle, however, but it comes from the heart. Just as a little diversion, High Commissioner Saunders wanted to, Chair? High Commissioner Saunders wanted to say something, and not only in the diplomatic sense, but she's also my friend, and I won't hear the end of it if she's not allowed to ask the question.
Thank you so much, Minister. That was a very inspiring presentation that you gave. And it's more of, I'm entreating you as a leader in the Caribbean while we're engaged in this strategic change process to instill some of the really good ideas that you shared with this audience, because the process is now very flawed. And unless somebody takes charge, narrows down the focus, and actually is engaged in a real exercise of strategic planning, we will be here, as Trinidadians say, spinning top in mud for the longest while. So I'm just asking, I'm begging you, as Minister of Foreign Affairs, with your colleagues in this arena where there's so much talk to speak of, very little action, and the implementation deficit, that we narrow it down and actually, for once, be strategic and plan wisely for the next 5, 20, 30 years, rather than keep going around in circles. Employ the people with the capacity, the expertise to put the thing together properly, and this illusion of saying we're planning when we're really not doing it. And sir, you know what I'm talking about. So I'm asking you, as we go forward to the meeting this month, to really instill some urgency and some focus, because a lot of what you said resonated with me, and Monica will share your speech with me, because I'm going to go through it and find all the very important areas that need to be further elucidated and ventilated. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think you'll agree that that was a very appropriate intervention, so thank you for your leave to do that. I was going to actually end with something about UNCTAD, but I think I'll start with it in the face of Amilcar's plea to take home stuff. Most of you know UNCTAD as a United Nations trade and development body. The acronym wasn't very flattering. Under no circumstances take a decision. I'm thinking that with the enlightenment of Minister Mitchell's speech and the querulousness of Amilcar's plea, that UNCTAD could possibly be changed to, and I just made this up, so I have to read it, unity and numbers for CARICOM to advance developmentally. So I think it's probably borne out by the fact that we talk about unity as a Caribbean body. And I say Caribbean as opposed to Caribbean because I understand there were no Caribs. There were actually Caribs. So that's what I was told. And with unity and with the numbers that Minister Mitchell spoke of, in the CARICOM body, we can advance developmentally. So that's that. So, Chair, Sir Edwin, members of the Diplomatic Corps, past and present, Brigadier Anthony Philip Spencer was here, campus registrar, UWI staff and students. And I think this evening I have the liberty to highlight Bahamian students, and I'm seeing the Bahamian Students Association president in the audience, and I'm also seeing our only postgraduate student from the Bahamas in the IIR program. So thank you so much. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen all, it is indeed a distinct pleasure to have been asked to proffer this vote of thanks on this historic occasion. I say historic because it is the first diplomatic dialogue to feature a Bahamian foreign minister. It is also the first diplomatic dialogue of 2014, and I am advised that the first dialogue is often the sentinel event of any particular year. Additionally, it is the first event of the Bahamas Consulate in 2014, the year I have unilaterally declared the Year of the Bahamas in Trinidad and Tobago. And although last night I was challenged by my friend of some long-standing Riyadh in Sonali that this appears to be the second first event in 1 year, because we celebrated our 40th anniversary of independence last July, I go on to tell you, Riyadh, that there'll be a third first, because our Right Honourable Prime Minister, Perry Christie, has graciously agreed to deliver a distinguished open lecture in a couple of months' time. So stay tuned for that. So that'll be the third first. Let me just get this together. It was both exciting and indeed gratifying that Director Knight immediately embraced the idea of having this particular diplomatic dialogue to feature none other than, as you've heard, my classmate and friend, who just happens to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration, Commonwealth of the Bahamas, Frederick Audley Mitchell. So first, we are deeply indebted to Professor Andy Knight, whom I have now dubbed the Dynamic Director of IIR. He quickly mobilized his ever-ready, like the batteries, hard-working staff, and while we must thank all of the Institute's staff, I would like to take particular time to point out and to single out Marilyn and Ikana. Partially because those are the only two names that I know, but they really did tirelessly a lot of work to bring this to the success that I think you will all agree it has been. The AV and technical staff, the room staging crew, the media are invaluable components to a session such as this, and we thank you. We extend a special thank you to our campus registrar, Mr. Richard Saunders, who's now making a name for himself in doing so many things in such a short time. And indeed, this evening, he's representing campus management at the senior level because most of them are away attending university meetings. So we thank you very much for taking out of your busy schedule to come and do this for us. Thanks also go to Marketing and Communications for their liaising functions. Thanks will also go to the caterers in a little while when you get released from this room. As I understand, they have prepared some repast when we descend to the IIR garden. I'm certain that I speak on behalf of all of us here. I speak on behalf of the director for sure. Oh, we're getting pan music too, thanks to the panists. I speak on behalf of the director, his staff, and all of us here when I express full gratitude to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Bahamas, headed in the absence of the minister by Permanent Secretary Philip Miller. We extend thanks to the ministerial delegation, which comprises Senior Foreign Service Officer Ms. Joy Newbold, Foreign Service Officer Mr. Jamal Strawn, and aide to the Minister, Mr. Desmond Taylor. On behalf of my classmate and friend, we thank his senatorial colleague, Cheryl Bazard, for attending the function, following another conference for which she was in Trinidad and Tobago. His longtime friend and colleague attorney, Stan Smith, a Bahamian residing in Barbados, for coming specifically to Trinidad and Tobago to support his friend and colleague. Now, as this vote of thanks concludes, you're probably wondering when it will conclude, I think we will all agree that the man of the moment, the Honourable Frederick Mitchell, has delivered a stellar talk. His lecture was done with distinction, and I must end with another acronym. I'm often called the acronym queen. I just love acronyms. And I thought this one, which will stage the letters of the 7-letter word CARICOM, would probably describe how Minister meshed his passion for CARICOM with his excellent delivery and inimitable style. C, I'll read it as a sentence. So we think that Mr. Mitchell delivered a charismatic, articulate, researched, and interesting chronicle of movement towards saving CARICOM. And a little inside joke here, Minister, you should be very proud. Thank you so much. One last thing that needs to be done, I'm asking Minister Mitchell to please pin Director Knight and Registrar Saunders with a 40th anniversary commemorative pin for the 40th anniversary of the Bahamas independence. We're still in the independence year. So, gentlemen. Photo of the Order of the Bahamas. It needs a woman's touch, apparently.
Feel free to join us for some grub downstairs and enjoy the music as well. Thank you very much.